Hey, somebody needs to separate the double yolks. You have? Excellent. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. You are listening to The Professional Noticer. Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Andrews. Hey, thank you for making me a part of your week. My purpose here today and with every show we do is to play the part of a best friend or a coach. I want to help you live the life of your wildest dreams by giving you access to the greatest mentors the world has to offer today. This week, The Professional Noticer is sponsored by wisdomharbor.com. Today, families and school systems all over America are finding wisdomharbor.com's one-of-a-kind streaming service to be the perfect, low-cost, high-quality educational tool for their students. Wisdom Harbor's stated responsibility is to create the next greatest generation, starting with your hometown and your school system. For less than $3 a month per teacher, classrooms have access to original content only found on wisdomharbor.com that teaches, entertains, and builds character in young people while creating conversations between young people and the adults in their community. Utilizing video, audio, and the written word, content is delivered in small bites by Grammy winners, CEOs, comedians, chefs, best-selling authors, and Hall of Fame speakers. There are even guitar lessons from an award-winning songwriter. Check it out today and join your friends and neighbors who are already a part of wisdomharbor.com. And isn't it time your schools got involved? wisdomharbor.com, creating America's next greatest generation, starting with your hometown. Observations and answers. That's what we do here on The Professional Noticer. And as you know, if you are a frequent viewer or listener, we love it when somebody comes to the table with observations and answers. And we have that today. And we have an exciting show. Or at least I'm excited. Okay, because this is a dream guest for me, even though he's already appeared on the show, I don't know, a bunch of times. But this is the first time to have him in studio. Usually he is like coming from the great white north and there's snow panes around him. But we have the New York Times bestselling author Michael Perry with us today. I won't go into all the different things Michael has done. Maybe I can crank some of those out of him, but I know him as a writer, as a humorist, and the author of some of my favorite books. Right here. Please welcome Michael Perry.
Hey, Andy.
Hey, buddy.
Good to be here.
I am so glad you're here. Now, you've been in town several days.
Yes, sir.
And so we haven't run out of things to talk about yet.
Not yet. I've noticed that the family is running out of time to listen to us.
Well, that's true. They tend to go to bed or need to eat or something.
And we're saying, but wait, there's more.
But wait, yeah, that reminds me of.
Yeah. I will say that one of the great joys of, as you said, we've talked a lot, but we've never met. And you just never know, how it's going to go. And, I saw you standing in the airport there and we shook hands and we started talking while we were walking and we really haven't stopped.
We haven't stopped. Yeah. I mean, and for if you're new to the history of our relationship, I was in Spring Green, Wisconsin, and just wandering through I had the afternoon. I was wandering through an independent bookstore, and this lady rushes up to me and she says, "Would you please join us in the basement? A tornado has been spotted several blocks away." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay." And there are people flying in the front door and down these stairs. And so I'm thinking, this must be the only place on the block with a basement. And so I have this pathological fear of being bored. I mean, I cannot take even 30, 40 seconds of doing nothing. And so as I'm swinging around the banister to head down, I grab a Coke out of the cooler and I grab a book off this table and I didn't even see what I grabbed. I made sure I didn't get a Diet Coke. But as far as the book, I didn't really pay attention. And after 20 or 30 minutes in that basement with dogs and cats and babies, and I thought, okay, if it was going to hit, it would have hit. And so I gave the lady $20. I said, I think this will cover what I got. And I got out of there and went back to where I was staying. I put the book in my suitcase. And then when I got home, few days later, I took it out and tossed it in my closet. And then at some point, Polly made me clean up my closet, and I picked it up and put it on a shelf. But there was some point, and it was like months later, that I picked it up, and I loved the title. I saw that whoever had written this was a first responder, a paramedic, a firefighter, and the name of the book was Population 485: Meeting Your Neighbors One Siren at a Time. And I thought, that's a cool title. That's a cool title. And so I started reading, and I don't know, 20 minutes later, Polly shows up, and I'm still standing there in front of my sink in the bathroom. And she says, "What are you reading?" I said, "This book that I snagged off the table in Spring Green, Wisconsin." I said, "This guy is great." And I loved that book. I just loved that book. And then I went online, in fact, because I'm like, who is Michael Perry? Who is this guy? And I found out that you had 10 or 12 books at the time. And I got them all. And I loved them all. And this is, I see missing here, Main Street. What else is missing?
I think there's
The Jesus Cow is missing here.
the Scavengers.
The Scavengers is missing.
I think I'm working on number 24 right now.
Really?
I think, yeah.
Yeah.
And
wow.
nobody's more surprised than me.
That's awesome, though.
And I will say, and I'm gonna toot your horn a little bit as if I need to, but I don't know about you, but I had a writer who was a huge influence on me a long time ago, a man named Jim Harrison, and nobody knows who he is either, except he wrote a novella called Legends of the Fall, which they know Brad Pitt.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I remember reading his work, and it was so meaningful to me stylistically. It made a big difference in my life. But I remember I would open his books, and he had the also by page, which was that whole list of titles that
Right.
he'd written. And I remember this was before I had Population out, and that's the cool way, by the way, we refer to Population 45 now. We just call it Population.
Yeah. Traveler's Gift to us here is TTG.
There you go. You get it.
The Traveler's Gift. Yeah.
But I remember looking at that also by and just going, man, someday I don't need to be rich and famous, but I'd love to have an also by page that looks like that. And I still remember about 3 books ago, Harper sent me the advanced proof, and I opened up to that also by page. And I remember like a little kid going, hey, it happened.
It happened.
You're
Look,
yeah.
I did this.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. When,
And you're also by page, at this point, it's also by pages. Yeah.
And when I mean, there is a bar you cross when you have a book published. There's a bar you cross when they let you write another one.
Yep.
Okay. Then there's a bar crossed when you get that also by. And there's a bar that some people cross where they have to divide their books up.
Yes,
It's like also by this series, this series, this series.
Yeah.
Bernard Cornwell, who is a historical fiction writer, I mean, I look at that and I go, how did you do this? How did you even do this?
Something else just occurred to me. I've never thought of this until this minute, but you and I both come from very different backgrounds in one sense, but we come from very common working class backgrounds in another.
Right.
And I've written in a couple of my books about how one of the struggles, and I use that word very lightly, I don't mean in any way to indicate that I've had a true struggle, but one of the struggles I've always had as a writer who's made a living as a writer, who's supported his family as a writer, I come from a place where the phrase I always use is, if you can't stack it or stack with it, it don't count.
Wow.
I grew up baling hay and logging, and so if
you can't stack it or stack with it,
it don't count. And so I've always felt self-conscious about that when I'm back among my people, my brother who's a sawyer and a logger, and my brother who's a farmer, and my dad who's a farmer, and the neighbors who go to the factory and make things, and I'm the guy that has soft hands and writes. So I always think of that, and then I always also think of that tendency we have, like I think of stacking firewood. there's that chip in us that we stack firewood for 2 hours. And then when you're done, you don't just walk to the house, you back off about 15 yards. You put your hands on your hips and you regard what you have accomplished.
Yeah.
And it just in this moment, as you and I were having that discussion.
And maybe sometimes we even go get our wives to
Yeah. Yes.
look at the firewood.
And boy, are they impressed.
Yeah.
As my wife says, do you want me to give you your little gold star?
Yes, right?
Right here. So until this very moment when we were talking about our also buy list, I realized that both of us, that's our version of looking at the lumber pile, the firewood stack. It's like, oh no, I really did stack some stuff up. So
that is true.
yeah, that was a fun little, you've led me to an insight this early in the podcast. We probably ought to just wrap it up. I assume this is as good as it's going to get.
You know, thinking about that also buy and thinking about that's our stack of firewood, I agree with that. I had, because, you know, by the time you're getting the final proofs of your book, you're just like, I don't know if this is any good or not. You know, you've read it so many times. It's like, please don't make me read this again. I just don't even, but I pay attention to that also buy. You make sure, are all the books in there? They put the children's books in there? Yeah.
That's funny too, because I had one where we missed one.
Really?
And I just remember the day that I realized that. And everything's going great. Got nothing to complain about. But I went, oh man.
Oh man.
We missed one. You know, and how many readers have I now missed because we
Yeah, right. Oh my gosh. You know, when I look at how those how that works, and how many times I'm thinking of this now about how many times you proof. Have you ever gone back? I mean, I know you had to, even with a major publisher, you go back and go, there's a typo.
I have two very specific stories about that. One that's embarrassing, and one that's a good story.
Well, let's go with the embarrassing one.
Well, with the good one, unfortunately, the good one's short. The other one's not as short. But during COVID, when everything shut down, I write for a living. Nothing I do happens if I don't sit down alone and spend the hours at the keyboard. Right. Having said that, as you and I have talked about many times, I'm self-employed. I've got kids. And so you need, to use a completely inartistic term, multiple revenue streams.
Right.
And one of mine is performing and speaking. And it's gotten to the point with me where about 50% of our income comes from me presenting myself physically in a public space.
Right.
And of course, when COVID hit, that went to zero immediately and stayed there for a while. And the good news was I had gotten started in this business by self-publishing. And I had a whole trove of things that weren't quite right for my big publisher. They weren't quite right for the small publisher, but we could certainly produce them. And so I did, I think, a series of 4 or 5 books that really kind of saved us during that stretch. And yeah, I'm looking at them now. Peaceful Persistence, Million Billion, Hunker, and there's one other one that's escaped.
I love this one.
Peace. Oh, I love that. I love the cover on that.
I love the cover too, and I got the T-shirt.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we do a special bundle, a T-shirt with the book.
Yeah, I love the Peaceful Persistence T-shirt.
So I don't want to say crank them out because I had an editor and we went through them, but the one particular book, I don't know how it happened. Well, I know how it happened because we were probably working a little too fast. It got out and I inadvertently used the penultimate edit, and it's got about 10 or 12 typos in it. They're not egregious. They're things like missing words or a word that somehow, a homophone, that the wrong there.
Right.
And boy, it was out before I realized we'd inadvertently. And then, of course, I got a couple of emails from people. And you know those people are always very gentle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But in that case, I had to eat it because I just had to say, yeah, no, that I missed that. And no, it wasn't the proofreader. It wasn't the editor. It was me giving my final okay. So it's on me. So that was grinding and really hard. But it was a good lesson. I think it didn't hurt that it happened 20 years in either. It's just one of those little moments where you go, hey, just so you know, they're a hot shot.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other one that I find fascinating, more from not from a mess up standpoint, but from people ask me all the time to give them writing tips and what should you do. And one of the ones I always talk about is reading your stuff out loud, which I hate. I don't like to stand in front of a mirror and read my stuff. And at this point, I've written so many things, I can't read it all aloud.
Right.
But I never forget the book Coop, which was put out by HarperCollins.
Which is like one of my two favorites that you've done.
I appreciate it.
I love Coop.
Yeah, that's about growing up on the farm and growing up in the somewhat unusual church that I grew up in, but also my parents taking in foster children. And then it's about the birth of my daughter, too.
Yeah, I love the subtitle, Coop, A Year of Poultry, Pigs, and Parenting.
And by the way, I'll come back to the typo thing, but now you've reminded me, we keep bringing up our wives. And one of the things you and I have talked about during this visit, our first face-to-face, is how fortunate we are.
Yeah.
That we have wives who are solid, they say they love us, and they seem to demonstrate it by their actions. They certainly demonstrate it through their patience.
That's a great way of putting it.
But we also say that there are times they make us uncomfortable in exactly the way we should be made uncomfortable. To put it another way, they hold us to account. And whenever I see, so at that point, when I wrote that book, part of the book too was my wife and I and our one little daughter moved to this farm. My wife is expecting a second. And our goal was not to become farmers. We both grew up on farms. We knew better than to think we were going to be farmers. But we started raising some pigs and chickens and bigger garden and that sort of thing. And so, of course, right when we hit our stride and the book is about the birth of our second child, I go off on book tour for this thing, and I'm doing 29 cities in 30 days. And everyone's saying, oh, he wrote this wonderful book about a year of poultry, pigs, and parenting. And my wife pointed out at one point, she said, you know, I'm so glad that everyone's loving that book and it's selling well and that you're running all over the country talking about that you wrote a book about raising chickens, pigs, chickens, pigs, and parenting. And she said, meanwhile, I'm back here at home raising chickens, pigs, and parenting.
Wow.
And I said, well, that's a fair observation.
That's a great observation.
But that book is published by HarperCollins. So by the time it goes to final proofs, galleys, whatever, I've been through it 50 times. My editor's been through it many, many times. 2 copy editors.
And you're reading it like this. Yeah, that page is okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Right. So it's been run through so many eyes. The last day, literally within 24 hours of the last opportunity to make any correction at all on the book before it goes to print, I had a public event. And I thought, you know what? I'm just going to, as a way of letting people know there's a new book coming down the pike, I'm just going to read a selection from chapter 2. And I opened up the actual galley that's going to go to print. And I read the first sentence and aloud. And there was a word missing, completely missing from the sentence that made it was an essential word. And the thing that fascinates me about that was all those eyes, we'd all looked at it, but I call it snowblind.
Right.
You've been looking at that manuscript so long that your brain just puts that word right in there. And it did it to all of us. And that's to circle all the way back to the original part of this little anecdote. That's why I tell people to read your stuff out loud, because your tongue will trip over things that your eye just bridges.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. I had...
By the way, did I ever hop on the phone and call New York?
I'll bet. I'll bet you did. I bet you stepped off stage and said, hang on right here before these presses run.
I was going to say my big chance to say, stop the presses.
Yeah. Man, when I wrote The Heart Mender, I had a different kind of mistake in it. Mm. It wasn't a typo, and I didn't notice the mistake until like 5 or 6 years later. Mm. And we were, the boys were old enough now to like listen to the book. So we were on our way to the hunting camp and we're playing it, playing the Audible. And so the book is set in 1942, small town America, and this German soldier who considers himself a German, not a Nazi, a German sailor. He gets wounded and he's rescued by an American war widow who finds him on the beach, almost kills him, and then for reasons that you have to read the book to find out, they decide to hide and stay together and hide in small town America. And so at one point near the first of the book, where she still does not trust him, and she's coming home from work, and he's sitting on the couch in his uniform, and I put in there that she baked a pan of biscuits from scratch, and he ate the whole pan, which seemed very reasonable to me. But then 5 or 6 years later, when I heard it, I was like, biscuits from scratch? In the 1940s, how else are they going to make them but from scratch? You wouldn't say from scratch, just make biscuits, because there ain't no canned biscuits. There's no frozen biscuits.
The Pillsbury Doughboy was not on the scene.
So
that's fascinating.
Yeah. So that was really weird to me, and nobody caught that either.
Well, and sometimes there's stuff that's just, you can't explain it. I think it's in the book. I wrote a book called Visiting Tom about my old neighbor and the cannons he builds and shoots. And that's, there it is. And that's a love story about his wife was quite ill, but it was her dream to see their 60th wedding anniversary. And so the arc of the book, she's trying to see if she's going to make it. But these are real folks. It's not a novel.
Right.
And in that book, and I don't know that it got corrected in the paperback, but I got an email. And then here's the other funny thing is, like, a book will sell thousands of copies, and I'll get an email 6 months later. So I know thousands of people have read it, but it's months later before the first person sent me an email and said, how come Tom is driving a Ford in chapter 1, and in the last chapter, it's a Chevy? And I said, well, I do not know. Right? So there's another example of something that seems blindingly obvious, but you just read it so many times you didn't.
I know.
Yeah.
I have one of those that's still in there in the Traveler's Gift, and it was several years before somebody had spotted it and said, in the first of the book, his daughter has light hair, and in the back of the book, she has dark hair.
Yeah, I have another one that it's not a mistake, but we're also talking a little bit about writing and how I think you and I take the idea of humility seriously, and we both have been given plenty of reason over the course of life to be humble.
Yes, like, how can you not be?
But occasionally it gets served to you on a silver platter. And I always especially love it when you were kind of trying to be a little, you just over-revved just a little bit, right? You should have maybe stayed down there in the lower RPMs, but you had to go for it, didn't you? And so I remember working on this line too, and I worked so hard on it, and I was so proud of it when I got there. So you've mentioned I'm from northern Wisconsin. And I just grew up with, you learn to function in 10, 20 below. And including, I was writing this piece about deer hunting when it was probably, between 10 and 0. And just, I was trying to describe to someone who wouldn't understand what it felt like to inhale air that was that cold. And I remember saying something, and now I'm forgetting how to quote even myself, but I described the feeling of, it was like inhaling sub-zero water. And I worded it much fancier than that, and if I'd have known we were going to talk about it, I'd have looked it up. But I was so proud of that line. And about 6 months later, some lady sent me an email with that quote highlighted, and she said, "You mean ice?"
Sub-zero water. You mean ice?
And if you guys do, do you do show notes for these things? I can find the exact quote.
Yeah.
We'll actually
Yeah.
put it in the show notes because
Okay.
it's, again, if I'd have known, I'm kind of happy that I don't have so much ego that I can just quote myself at will.
Right.
Either.
Right.
But yeah, it's just those moments where you're so proud of this, you lovingly crafted this line, and then somebody just goes, yeah, you. The other one is where, like, I'll write for a page and a half, and and the earth and shaping the earth and crafting the earth, and then you go, there's that little voice that goes, or you could just say it's a shovel.
Right. Yeah. Hey, can you read? Do you mind reading the first part of Population 485?
Sure, you bet.
I think there's several comments I want to make about your first couple of pages or paragraphs or whatever.
All right.
But I would urge you to listen to this and just see this is not slapdash. Okay, this is well thought out writing that I greatly admire. All right, go, Mike.
Summer here comes on like a zaftig hippie chick, jazzed on chlorophyll and flinging fistfuls of butterflies to the sun. The swamps grow spongy and pungent. Standing water goes warm and soupy, clotted with frog eggs and twitching with larvae. Along the ditches, heron-legged stalks of canary grass shoot 6 feet high and unfurl seed plumes. In the fields, the clover pops its blooms, and corn trembles for the sky. If you were approaching from the sky, you'd see farmland neatly delineated by tilled squares and irrigated circles. The forests, mostly hardwoods and new-growth pine, butt up against fields, terminating abruptly, squared off at fence lines. The swamps and wetlands, on the other hand, respect no such boundaries and simply meander the lay of the land, spreading organically in fecund 100-acre stains. The whole works is done up in an infinite palette of greens. There's a road below, a slim strip of County 2 lane, where the faded blacktop runs east-west, then bends at Jabowski's corner like an elbow. In the crook of the elbow, right in the space where you'd cradle a baby, is a clot of people. My mother is there, and my sister, and several volunteer firefighters, and I have just joined them, and we're all on our knees, kneeling in a ring around a young girl who has been horribly injured in a car wreck. She's crying out, and we are doing what we can, but she feels death pressing at her chest. She tells us this, and we deny it. Tell her, no, help is on the way.
Wow. I don't know that anybody who has not sat behind a computer keyboard or typewriter and stared at that page could have any idea of the hours that were put into that, just what you read right there. I mean, it's almost like a puzzle that you have all the parts, but all the parts aren't in front of you. And you have to circle the house and maybe go outside to find a part to bring back to put in Zaftig.
Yeah. I think, I'm always, partly because, again, my background, blue collar, I get uncomfortable talking about what I call the woo-woo parts of writing. But in fact, that's the part I love. And when I think of that particular piece, I've, for various reasons, never had a drop of alcohol, never taken a psychedelic, never smoked anything.
You and Ted Nugent.
Me and Ted Nugent. And so I've had to find a way over time. And I'm also a very repressed Midwestern stoic. Right? We don't want to talk about our feelings, and you can't make us. And yet I wound up making a living doing something where I have to open myself up all the time to people. And then I have to also, and this is the woo-woo part, open my head up to images like corn blooms unfurling themselves. And so for me, it's always been sometimes getting overtired, sometimes listening to the right music, and then sometimes, like you said, just go do something else and let those images percolate. And speaking of percolate, like I do remember that those paragraphs are definitely a reflection of the fact that my gateway drug into writing was poetry.
Okay.
And I worked really hard at poetry for many years. And in fact, some of the images from that paragraph were from a very early poem, just a line or two. But I realized pretty quickly two things. One, that I wasn't a very good poet. And secondly, that it was really hard to make a living as a poet.
Yeah.
But you let those things percolate. And in the case of some of those lines, they were banging around in my head probably for several years. And then you do, as you said, you start putting it together. And I actually work really fundamentally with that stuff. I literally print stuff out and cut it up with a scissors and lay it out on tables.
I do too.
Yeah, move it around. And sometimes I think people, especially folks who want to write, they think, oh, I'm supposed to be seeing this as a piece and it should flow from me. Or you hear people say, oh, this was given to me. And I go, dude, nothing. I've always had to chase mine down and beat it with a stick. It's like,
right.
And then you mentioned that word Zoftig. And one of the things I love about that, you and I talk all the time about mentors and people who've been meaningful to us and are still meaningful to us, or something somebody said to us has echoed down through the years. And every time I read that line and I use the word Zoftig, which I did not learn at the feed mill in New Auburn, Wisconsin, I just remember I had a mentor, a man named Frank, who he was my very first real editor. And it was at a tiny little regional magazine, barely went outside our county. But he took his job seriously. And he was a master. He saw in me some raw talent. I had a nursing degree and had been working on a ranch in Wyoming. I did not get an MFA.
The cowboy nurse.
That's right. But he saw some sort of raw talent, and he was a master at encouraging me, but also holding me to account. I remember we used to meet in this little coffee shop, and I'd bring my poems, because I was a thoughtful, reflective, insightful, long-haired poet at the time. And he was so good at just saying, well, I can show you some things at work here. But then he'd get out that red pen and he'd hit that thing and he'd just beat it up. And I loved it. And so he taught me so much. I would not be sitting here talking to you if it wasn't for Frank and the things he taught me. But I'll never forget that when he read the draft of this book, he had many wonderful things to say, but he said, you got to lose the word Zoftig. Nobody knows what it means. It's kind of pretentious. And I just remember taking it out and putting it back in and taking it out and putting it back in. And then at some point I just said, no, I just feel like that word needs to be in there. And all these years later, people will still come up to me. And sometimes they go, I had to look up that word Zoftig. And I go, well, that's okay. That's how I found it. They said, well, I had to look it up in the dictionary. And I always go, well, where do you think I found it? Furthermore, that's where they keep words.
Yeah, that's where they keep words. Yeah,
So,
I looked, the first time I heard it, I looked it up too.
And the thing that I think about that, and you and I have discussed, is that there's this time when your mentor has taught you enough to be able to reject the advice of your mentor. And you don't do it blithely and you don't do it petulantly.
And you're not rejecting the mentor.
Absolutely not. The work doesn't exist without the mentor. But he or she has given you the knowledge that, no, now it's time for me to, and you hear that in athletics all the time, or music. You really see it a lot in music. You have the mentor that teaches you this base. And then actually, I have a friend that I've known since he was a penniless musician. He was so penniless that he was in my band. And I watched him grow, and I watched him. He had a thing that was really working well and packing the house, but in a very, again, inside the county, he could play and pack the house.
Right.
And then at some point, he asked me for advice, and he said, I'm scared to go, but I feel like I need to go do something different. And I'm telling the short version of it, but I basically said, you can continue to be the most popular act in Chippewa County, Eau Claire County. Or I said, yeah, you could go and you might lose it all, but you'll never know unless you go. And then he went, and the story is he then went on to win 2 Grammys, and he's touring the world, and he's very successful. But what I love, I'm getting back to the mentor point. He has stated in public from the stage in Rolling Stone that he considers me a mentor, and
Yeah.
he'll cite Population 45. But you know what? I loved his old music. And when he came out of the woods, he literally went in a hunting shack and did this album that broke him, made him huge. When he came out of the woods, he gave just a handful of us a CDR of this new album that he'd made all by himself in the woods. And he said, I want you to tell me what you think. And I listened to it, and this is a guy, he's got a voice like this. He can sing the blues like an 80-year-old man. And here comes this music, and it sounds different just sonically, but most of the time, he's singing in falsetto. And I just took it back to him, and I said, well, first of all, I'm proud of you because you did that. You're taking a chance, and you went in a different direction. And I said, musically, I find it fascinating. But I said, but I think with your voice, I wouldn't sing in falsetto. 2 Grammys and 14 world tours later, guess who rejected the advice of the mentor?
Yeah.
And I love it. It's one of my favorite stories because so many people are eager to go, oh, yeah, I was there. I taught him this and I taught him that. And I go, no, I'm the guy that gave him the worst advice in the world. But fortunately, he had learned enough to know, no, this is what I hear. This is what I feel. This is what I'm going with. So
that's very interesting. Here's another word from what you read.
Oh, boy.
That I am interested in.
I hope I know it.
Fecund.
Oh, fecund, yeah.
All right, now let me just say something. I want to know where you found fecund, because there are only 3 authors that I know of, that have used the word fecund.
Mm-hmm.
You're one, I'm one, and there's another one. And I'm curious as to where this word came about for you.
So my answer is going to disappoint you a little bit, but it'll lead to further discussion. I don't remember, but I'm going to say that it was one of 2 places. I did, from the age of 4 years old on, read voraciously and omnivorously. So somewhere in there, I probably came across that word and didn't know what it meant and didn't know how to pronounce it, and then went to the dictionary and looked it up. So that is very possible. It's also possible, and this is the really disappointing answer, that I found it in the thesaurus. You know, everyone's like, oh, the thesaurus, that's a crutch. No. It's a repository of beautiful, gorgeous words. And, and this is a whole other discussion I have, that there's a fine line between, using a big fancy word to show off, that's a tin horn trick. And I'm also very open about the fact that there are times that I do peg the needle. And it would have been okay just to say shovel. But I also have become, over the years, less and less apologetic about that, because to me, I have minor synesthesia. I just sort of see, I don't have it 24/7. It's not intense. But if I see, like, the word declivitous to me is a shiny word with chrome on it and a lot of sharp corners. And it happens to mean a very steep descent. And if that word, that beautiful, beautiful word with that beautiful rhythm, declivitous, there's a beat to it. If it fits the sentence beautifully, rhythmically, and, oh, by the way, it's conveying what I'm trying to convey, then I'm going to go ahead and use it. And again, I get the thing, well, I had to look it up in the dictionary. And first of all, I will try to put it in a context where if you don't have a dictionary, you still know what I mean.
Right.
The star, I think it was probably something about the declivitous descent of a star from the sky. Well, you can probably figure out what I mean. But then the other thing, the phrase I finally came up with is, why should we let the fancy people hog all the fancy words? Because I don't have a lot of patience for that. Well, I don't need to know no fancy. Well, you know what? Words are beautiful.
Yeah.
And sometimes that beautiful word is turbocharger.
Right.
So I will stick up sometimes for the fancy words. But so fecund, where did you find it?
James Lee Burke.
Oh, I met his daughter once.
Really?
Yeah, at some,
and what is her name? Her name?
Alifair.
Alifair, because that's the daughter of his character in the book.
Yes.
In his books, he has this character, Dave Robichaux, who is a sheriff's investigator for one parish in Louisiana. And those books are great. They're great. But
There's your tangent. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm having a clear memory. We were at I think it might have been in Chicago, and it's one of those deals. You've done them too. You meet someone, you have a very intense, wonderful conversation while you're eating your rubber chicken,
Yeah.
and then you never see each other
Never see 'em
again.
again.
And I just have a very clear recollection of speaking to his daughter. She was an attorney, but also a writer. And yeah,
Oh, man,
James Lee Burke.
I'll bet you he has the word fecund in every book he's ever written. And when I read it the first time, it was talking about the swamps in Louisiana and the air. And so, like you said, I kind of knew what it meant, but by the context he had used.
Yeah.
But then as I see it in another book and see it in another book, I finally looked it up. And so when I wrote Just Jones, I told Polly, I said, one thing about this book, it's going to have the word fecund in it.
It's what they call an Easter egg.
Yeah.
Yeah, you find it and you go, oh, this is more than for the book. This is for someone out there. Yeah. And you just reminded me too that part of the reason I opened with that scene, I'm from Wisconsin. When I'm in Alabama, last night we met a bunch of wonderful people, and half of those people will say, you're from Wisconsin. Oh, the frozen tundra. Oh, it's so cold. I don't know how you do it. But we have extremely southern summers, especially right where I'm from, because we lived in very flat, swampy part of Wisconsin. And yeah, in the winter it's miserable cold, but in the summer it's mosquitoes and haze and humid and muggy and all those things. And I think the greenery just becomes jungly. And I think we, in a way, almost notice that more because we're so hungry for it by the time it gets there.
Yeah.
So it was.
This is off topic, but so mosquitoes are bad in Wisconsin, or bad where you are.
I always said they were bad, and they are bad. They're heavy. But until I went out one spring and did irrigating in Wyoming. And they did flood irrigating, and it was one of the favorite jobs I've ever had. And as a matter of fact, it's one of the few times, we talked about if you can't stack it or stack with it. So my skills around the people I value, my skills don't count for much, and I'm always trying to find a way. And so when I worked on the ranch there as a young man, a couple of times I went out early and helped with the irrigating, and I loved it because the flood irrigating, you literally went out, you used to go out with a horse and a shovel, but you went out with a four-wheeler and a shovel. And you had to read the land. There were these little feeder ditches, and you'd cut a little notch and you'd dump water out, but you had to dump it out in such a way that it would fan across an area half a mile away. And the way you used to do it before the time of drones and things like that is you cut that little thing and you spend the whole day doing that. And then 4 or 5 days later, you'd go back and you'd see what's green. And then you'd adjust your dams and your notches accordingly. And I loved it because you were all alone. I love being alone. And you just had this very measurable result.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so many years later, my wife and I had gone out to visit my boss and happened to get out there just when we discovered he needed to go in for a cancer treatment. And it was irrigating time. And I said, you know what?
I know.
You go. I can do this. And I can remember the fullness in my heart that I was able to do something fundamental for this man who he is one of my top 5 mentors.
Wow.
And so what was the point, Mike? Had to do with irrigating. And in the spring in Wyoming, when we would turn the water loose and you were working in the river bottoms, you were literally furred with mosquitoes.
Oh, my God.
Like slap your thigh and leave your handprint in dead mosquitoes. And so you know how we all want to take perverse pride in the worst things about where we're from? And I was all, well, Wisconsin. And we sell T-shirts in Wisconsin. State bird.
State bird, mosquito, yeah.
Yeah, but I got to say, I've never had worse mosquitoes than in the bottomlands of the AA Ranch in Elk Mountain, Wyoming.
But see, here's something that's curious to me.
Yeah.
And there is a thing that is said in Alabama, in South Alabama especially, because we have mosquitoes in our swamps and all of this. And this did not occur to me until my next door neighbor, whom you met yesterday, Brian Backen from Regina, Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm.
And he heard this and he brought this up to me, and I had never thought of this. I've read books about, in Canada and the mosquitoes, and Wisconsin mosquitoes, and Wyoming up in the mountains, the mosquitoes, but it never occurred to me that in Alabama, especially South Alabama, we hear a lot of people go, didn't get very cold this winter. The mosquitoes are going to be horrible because it didn't really get cold. And Brian told me one day, he said, it gets really cold in Saskatchewan,
Yes.
and the mosquitoes are worse than they are here.
Yeah.
And so I thought, never occurred to me.
Yeah, things like mosquitoes and black flies, and they'll just rage for short bursts of time.
We'll be out in the middle of the Gulf, and all of a sudden the boat will be full of black flies.
Interesting. They must just get swept along.
I don't know, but they bite.
Oh yeah,
man.
You see them a lot up around the Great Lakes. Like I'm near Lake Superior, and you be on the shore of Lake Superior, and it'll be a gorgeous, beautiful day, and you got to go because they're just biting your ankles.
Right.
Yeah.
There is a kind of writing that I really enjoy reading, and not everybody can pull it off. And English teachers would mark all over it, or at least my English teachers would have. And they would call it a run-on sentence, okay? But if it's done well, and I think I first became aware of how much I liked things that went on and on and on and on and on with a Jerry Reed song.
Excellent. Now we're in my wheelhouse.
Yeah, and I don't know if you remember, She Got the Gold Mine, I Got the Shaft.
Yes, sir.
But the first of that
Judge.
Judge. But the first of that thing is, I think it's back in 73 when Eating My Cooking got the better of me, and I asked this little girl I was going with to be my wife. Well, she said she would, and I said I do, but I'd have said I wouldn't if I'd have just knew how saying I do was going to screw up all of my life. I love that. That is just genius to me. And so I love it when somebody can write a run-on sentence that flows. And you have a particular run-on sentence that I think is hilarious.
Is this the payback one?
No, this is the kitty.
Oh.
The kitten, the cat that's drunk.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so listen to this. One sentence here. I have never been hungover in my life, and I'm not saying that cat was, but this was my first thought, and I went with it, imagining him down at the kitty tavern till all hours, knocking back miniature beers and teensy chasers, maybe purring at some lady kitty and nudging the catnip chews her way until he remembered he'd been fixed, at which point he retreated with his beer to the jukebox, where he slumped into more serious drinking, his pupils sad and wide in the barroom gloom, his tail limp.
Sometimes you take a shot.
I just love that. I just love that. And can I use your if you will? This is the Elvis thing that I asked you to find. Now, you already know Michael Perry's is like he's top 5 to me. Okay. And I'm not sure who the other 4 would be, except for Robert Rourke, but Michael Perry's top 5. And so the way I know somebody's top 5 is if I like their books, but I also am fascinated by particular parts of them. And so now let me ask you this. What book, because I obviously didn't have it, what book, and I've got it somewhere, I just didn't have it where I could lay my hands on it. What book is the Elvis essay in?
It's from a book called Off Main Street, which is a collection of a lot of the essays and magazine pieces I did right before Population 485 came out.
Okay. Off Main Street.
Off Main Street
is the name of this book. And so after I'd read Population 485, I was reading everything you did. And so I'm loving these essays. I'm loving these articles. And I get to one about Elvis. Now, how many Elvis articles have you read? How many things about Elvis have you read? How many movies and books? And I mean, it's like, really? It's like, okay, I'm gonna do an article about air. Okay, yeah. I mean, Elvis is like air.
You know what? Elvis is everywhere,
He is.
as Mojo Nixon, the late Mojo Nixon said.
He
Elvis is everywhere.
But when I read this article, I thought that is the best piece about Elvis I've ever read in my life.
Gosh.
And it explains there. And I'm going to see, I'm not going to read the whole article. I want to read the first of it. And you grew up in a situation where no televisions, no movies, no radios.
No Elvis in those hips for sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We just, I grew up in a loving, wonderful family. I've written in my books about, I had the greatest parents in the world, but I was raised in a very obscure fundamentalist Christian sect. And part of it was no radio, no TV, no movies, no dancing, that sort of
See,
stuff.
I think it's fascinating that the first thing you ever knew about the Beatles was when?
Yeah, I went to school one day, and my math teacher, who was kind of upon reflection, probably kind of a stoner hippie, but a smart one, and he was truly devastated. I could tell he was emotionally distraught, and I liked him, and I asked him what was up, and he said, "Well, John Lennon was killed last night," and I said, "Oh, who's John Lennon?" And he showed up the next day with a stack of pirated cassettes.
Right.
Yeah. And so that I really didn't know who the Beatles were. I'd probably, don't get me wrong, I probably heard it on
Mm-hmm.
someone else's car radio. And obviously I went to a public school, so it's not like I never heard the radio.
Right.
But I didn't know who the Beatles were as an entity.
So I think this first part of this is interesting.
And we certainly did not have Elvis records.
The first thing I remember about Elvis is that he was dead. The news was post-dated and obtained in an oblique fashion, but that, as it turns out, is precisely the point where Elvis and I are concerned. The Elvis I know has almost nothing to do with albums or films and almost everything to do with saturation and assimilation. I never went looking for him, never bought his music, never watched his movies. He filtered down and found me in all his mutable states: the thin Elvis, the fat Elvis, the army Elvis, the Vegas Elvis, the hero, the has-been. To many of my generation, he is simply the osmotic Elvis. I mean, I think that's just... And I want to find a couple of pieces in here, because there's one place where you explain, and it's the first time I've ever seen it explained, how Elvis happened.
Yeah, and while you're finding that, I can just say that pretty much as described there, I didn't know about the Elvis. I didn't understand his place in culture. And yet, I think in the piece somewhere there, I mentioned, like, I would use as a joke the phrase, Elvis has left the building. Well, I never heard that from a firsthand source. I heard other people saying it.
Right.
And so I got the joke. I had no idea the context. So that when I say osmotic Elvis, and there's another thing, give me the high sign when you found what you need, but coming up with the idea of it being osmosis, that did not spring out of my brilliant mind. That's literally hammering away for days going, what is it? How can I explain how this filtered to me? How, that I didn't just go to the movie or I didn't buy the album. And then, you start letting your head go and making free associations and you say, oh, that's kind of like osmosis, isn't it? So,
By the way, just as an aside, osmosis is the only thing I remember from high school science. The definition of osmosis: when an liquid of high concentration moves to a liquid of low concentration through a semi-permeable membrane.
This has been the Dr. Andy Andrews Show.
Dr. Andy Show. Okay, listen to this. He wasn't the first rock star. Some say he was Bill Haley and Little Richard would, He wasn't the first rock star. Some say that was Bill Haley, and Little Richard would have something to say about that. No, rock and roll was ready and waiting for Elvis. He rode it like the ride it was, but it was moving when he got on, and it moved even faster when he got off. Some say the rock and roll went out of Elvis as far back as 58, the day his hair hit the floor of an army barbershop. It's an important point. We call Elvis the king of rock and roll, but that title alone fails to explain his perennial pervasiveness. In The Academic Elvis, Simon Frith writes, his fame was dependent on the new mass media of television, top 40 radio, the teen magazine, the LP. It's a valid point, but it requires expansion. Now, listen to this. I was the firstborn grandchild on both sides of the family. My baby scrapbook bulges with stacks of film and copious notations documenting my precocious aptitudes. My brother followed in 2 years. His scrapbook is well stocked, but comparatively slim. A second brother arrived 3 years later. A few pages into the scrapbook, it is as if he stopped developing. The rest of the pages are empty. Today's latter-born celebrities can command media saturation Colonel Parker could only dream of, but our interest is diluted. Elvis was our mass media firstborn, and we have never kept such a scrapbook since. That explains it.
Glad I worked hard on that so that 20 years later you could say that.
And there's another place in here that really.
By the way, the much older me would say probably also Sister Rosetta Tharpe would have something to say about all of this. But that's another show.
Okay, so hang on.
I think also I was just thinking of other things that I would joke about, not really realizing. And the other one I used to make jokes about was the Velvet Elvis. You know, all those paintings,
right,
black velvet. Yeah. And so, again, all of it coming at me kind of sideways, not through the speakers or off the screen, just culturally osmotic and filtering in and I suppose in some way corrupting me, but educating me anyway about the variety in the world.
I didn't mean to find this part, but I found this part and I laughed out loud when I read this. So talking about how Elvis, his behavior and all like this, and you say, and then in the mitigation category, we have become inured to celebrity misbehavior. Elvis and his penchant for panty-clad wrestling girls offended 1950s sensibilities. But the year he died, Sid Vicious and the Sex Pistols lurched into America. By October of 78, Vicious was charged with stabbing his girlfriend to death. 4 months later, Vicious himself was dead. Shooting one's television suddenly seemed positively quaint. But one need not pick on punk rockers to define deviancy downward. In the 20 years since Elvis pitched forward to glory, a score of his exploits have been eclipsed by any number of our most favored televangelists. In the end, the fact that Elvis lacked Mick Jagger's metabolism and Keith Richards' liver allowed him to mount a posthumous comeback that Jims, Baker, and Swaggart can only pray for. And perhaps the academics, frequently loathed, embarrassed, or unable to judge him as an artist, will let down their hair and let Elvis climb up the ivory tower. Okay, there's one more place, and I've got to find this because this is what nailed the whole thing in about how big Elvis actually still is. Okay, here it is.
All right. This is fun. I haven't read this essay in years.
This is just,
it's like visiting.
this is freaking brilliant. Everything Elvis is a tribute. Even the embarrassments, the TikTok clocks that dance, the Elvis shampoo. If I'm wrong and academic turns on him, all the better. The more vitriolic or condescending the observations, the more they stand tribute to an insatiable need to establish the proper position of the icon, to the power of the icon to evoke. Now listen to this. Do you doubt that Elvis can still evoke? I share my first name, Michael. I share my first name with two of the most recognized men in the world, Michael Jackson and Michael Jordan. No one ever makes that association. But if your name is Elvis, you cannot escape the association. I have no acquaintances named Elvis, although I can think of a few well-known Elvi. Elvis Grbac, the NFL quarterback, Elvis Costello, the musician, and Elvis Stojko, the champion figure skater. But here's the thing. The first time I heard these names, and the last time I heard them, I thought immediately of Elvis Presley. What other name triggers that instant connection? Adolf, maybe. Jesus, certainly. There was a time, I suppose, when people named their boy Elvis because they liked the name, or they had an Uncle Elvis who was dear to the family and got kicked in the head by a mule. But somewhere along the line, the boy from Tupelo, Mississippi stole that name forever, and no one else can ever truly have it for their own. You take that name, you live with a legend. Make no mistake, the legend lives, but the man is gone. I have it on good authority from Nashville reporter and Graceland Wake attendee Bill Hance that Elvis is indeed dead. As he said, I done seen him. And posthumous rehab can only do so much.
Man, that's like visiting younger me.
And here's the last line. Describing an all-star musical tribute to Elvis, an author writing for Esquire said, tributes can be dangerous things because sometimes all they prove is that it takes 40 performers to not quite recall one Elvis. Mm-hmm. Buddy, that's not only great writing, that's so insightful, it just kills me.
Well, thanks. Truly, I was commenting a couple of times there. It's sometimes you must do this with all your books. You go back. Both of us have talked. We do a lot of goofy stuff. We write a lot of humor, but we do put our heart and soul into what we do. I really mean what I write, but it is interesting to go back and read things like that and go, I don't remember. That guy sounds a little smarter than me.
Yeah.
Or you don't remember where you were at that time.
And you go back and read it and go, I don't really remember writing that.
I mean, your journey, of course, has been incredible. And I think you must go back sometimes and read that early stuff. And it's this mix of gratitude that you even got the chance, that it worked out. But it's also that mystery of your past self.
Right.
You go, I know I'm still him, but wow.
Yeah. So, listen. While you're here, mm-hmm. we're going to end this podcast and then immediately record another one. And so if you're watching this one, hang on. A couple of months from now, we're going to have another Michael Perry podcast for you. But before I get out of this one, I have to mention this. This is the latest book. This is called 40 Acres Deep. And as you and I talked, the past couple or 3 years, you would make reference almost every time to, I'm still struggling with this whole concept of not writing it, of even releasing it. Mm-hmm. And you would say to me, it's pretty dark. And so when I finally got a hold of it, when I finally got a hold of this book, I was blown away from a different angle by you, because as you say, you're known for these humorous books, and this book it has humor in it, but it's pretty dark. So, and I heard last night when we were at the Floribama doing the authors, um, the authors event, and Austin was there singing. I heard you tell a couple of people, "Hey, I see you got that book. Just know that's not like the other." So tell me why you're nervous about this book, and briefly explain what it's about.
It's the short version is it's a farmer watching his farm and his life and his wife slip away. And in the end, it's not a spoiler, he slips away. So that's the part where I say it's not a happy book. And it's fiction, but it's absolutely the people surrounding me. It's a story that unfortunately is unfolding every day in Wisconsin. And so that's the story. But it's also about a feeling that a lot of us have, I think, that things have always been changing, but they're changing at a pace now where it's really hard, even for those of us who are engaged, to keep up. And he's also watching people who take shortcuts morally, ethically, and win.
And when?
And that's it. There's no happy revenge bit. It's like, no, they're winning. And so I think that part has been the part that has appealed to people universally. So the thing that made me nervous about it was, yes, the darkness. It is unrelenting. There is literally a shoot of hope at the very end, but even that is a very qualified shoot of hope.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing was that through fiction, this character expresses some things in my own heart that I know are not universal. But in the other sense, it was a relief also to let him say some of those things.
Yeah.
But yeah, all in all, and then the upshot of it is we finally did release it. The publishers didn't want it. My agent, I have a terrific agent, and what I love about her, she's honest with me, and she just said, yeah, this just in the current environment and with these folks is not going to work. I wasn't upset about that. It was kind of what I expected to hear. So we just brought it out on our own, and it is blown my doors off how it's doing. But even more than that, the emails and the letters that I'm getting, and I'm being asked to speak at mental health events for farmers and things like that. And I'm not changing the world, but boy, making some connections. I think on my website the other day, we put up a shot of two of the notes that I've received as a result of this book, and we blacked out, identifying information. But so yes, I was just concerned, A, because people expect a certain style from me, and then B, because it's heavy and it deals with heavy stuff. But it's one of those where now that I did it, I'm really relieved.
Well, you've pushed yourself into another high category in my eyes, because you not only wrote another book, you wrote a novella.
Oh, yeah. So I forgot to say that.
Not everybody's written a novella.
It was always... So this kind of takes us back to where we started today. Jim Harrison, the author that meant so much to me as a writer. He was a complicated dude, but as his writing... He wrote a lot of novellas, and it's a form that just isn't very common. And in the back of my mind, not only did I want my also by page to be long like his, but I thought one day I want to write a novella. And this started out as a short story. And then one day I just realized, you know what? It's a novella. It's shorter than a novel and longer than a short story. So your guy can cut this if you need to, because it's a podcast, but can I put in a teaser for the next show, even though you don't know what the next show is going to be about?
Please, yeah.
The teaser is, it's too long to do right now, but you said that wonderful thing about the run-on sentences. So I have a writerly thing that I want to say about that I've learned from two mentors that weren't my friends, but they were my mentors on the page.
Okay.
So we'll talk about it from a writer's perspective. But you've also said so many wonderful, kind things about me. The run-on sentence story, there's an example I can give you also to show you how incredibly petty and vengeful I can be.
Oh, okay. All right.
So if you want to hear that story, you got to find the next episode.
There you go.
Whatever episode it ends up being.
And on the next episode, we're also going to explore who you dedicated this book to and why.
Okay, yeah.
My wife was a very very interested.
Yeah, you bet.
In that.
This will be great. It won't be the next episode, next chronologically, will it? It'll be the next Mike Perry.
The next Mike Perry
All
episode.
right.
Okay. So thanks for being here, buddy.
My pleasure. This
Absolutely.
is fun.
I'm Andy Andrews, the professional noticer, harnessing common sense and wisdom to plow through challenges all the way to an answer for you. And I think that'll do it for this week. Get us out of here, Matthew. So, ladies and gentlemen, and to the boys and girls who aspire to become ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of another episode of The Professional Noticer. In a world where common sense has become a superpower, I'm harnessing the tiny bit of mental energy I have for you, seeking wisdom, making observations, and endeavoring to answer tough questions in a way that will empower your family and your business. I'm Andy Andrews. Until next week, goodbye. This episode of The Professional Noticer was produced by Matt Limpert. The Noticer theme written and performed by Sugarcane Jane. Garlic necklaces for the cast and crew provided by Twinkle and Smoke of Beverly Hills. Additional financial consideration provided by literaryvapor.com. Friend, do you consider yourself an adequate communicator? Does the English language seem to flow naturally from the golden vocal cords of your glorious throat? Allow the good folks at literaryvapor.com to step in and remind you that even though you might have a prodigious vocabulary and be nailing the pronunciation of every word in the Oxford Dictionary, you might still be embarrassing yourself by scattering words into your conversations that do not actually exist. Non-words such as irregardless and conversate are literary vapor and head a long list of things you probably say that is just one more thing that makes you a bad example for school children everywhere. Neither is snuck or sneakened a word. One can sneak, but never can one have snuck or sneakened away. Supposedly is also literary vapor. Supposedly is correct. Supposedly marks you as a person who desperately needs literaryvapor.com. Undoubtedly is also incorrect. Supposedly and undoubtedly are commonly used words that do not even exist. So don't embarrass yourself. Subscribe now to literaryvapor.com and uncover the entire list and come face to face with your ignorance. Unhabitable, themself, refudiate, a lot, bigly, they're all on there. literaryvapor.com.